All right, today we're going to tackle a question that seems like simple trivia, but trust me, is actually one of the most revealing questions you can ask about modern history. So I'll ask you straight up, when did World War II begin? Take a second. What's the date that just popped into your head? For most people, especially in the West, one answer comes to mind almost instantly, September 1st, 1939. But what if I told you that for millions and millions of people, that date is just wrong?
Yeah, because the truth is, the start of the Second World War isn't a single hard fact. It's all about perspective. It's about national memory, and it's about the story that a country chooses to tell about itself. The start date you pick? Well, in many ways, it's a choice.
What we're about to see is that different nations have completely different day ones for the war. And this totally challenges that simple, monolithic story we all learned, revealing a much more complex and, frankly, a much more interesting picture of how this global conflict actually ignited. So first, let's break down the date that's taught in most textbooks across Europe and North America, 1939. This is the date that anchors the whole conflict in Europe, and it's a narrative that was largely shaped by the Western powers who, would ultimately be on the winning side. So on September 1st, Germany invades Poland. This is the spark. 2 days later, Britain and France, honoring their alliance with Poland, declare war. The conflict immediately starts to go global as Commonwealth nations like Canada jump in. And then, and this is a part people sometimes forget, on the 17th, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. This was all part of a secret deal, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where the Nazis and the Soviets agreed to carve up Poland between them. This crazy cascade of events firmly kicks off a major European war. The logic for using the 1939 date is often framed like this. The argument goes that other conflicts, like the brutal Second Sino-Japanese War that began way back in 1937, were just regional. They didn't directly involve the great powers of Europe, so you couldn't really call it a world war. But here's the counterargument. If you follow that logic to its conclusion, then on September 1st, 1939, the conflict was just between Germany and Poland, right? It wasn't a world war on day one either. It only became one when other global powers got pulled in, and this is where that very Eurocentric view starts to get a little complicated. Because for tens of millions of people, the war had already been raging for years before German tanks ever rolled into Poland. So let's take a look at their stories. In China, for example, the war is widely considered to have begun in 1937 with Japan's full-scale invasion. It was a horrific conflict that would claim millions of lives. Some historians would even push that date back further to 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria. From this perspective, you really had two separate, massive wars happening at the same time, one in Asia and one in Europe, that only truly merged into one world war after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And this really shows you how a single start date can just erase the experiences of entire nations. For the Chinese, like we said, it began in 1937. For Czechs, the war effectively started when Germany just occupied their whole country in March of 1939. For Albanians, it was the Italian invasion a month later. If we choose to stick with September 1st, we're overlooking all of these crucial, devastating beginnings. Now, let's turn to Russia. This is fascinating because they built a completely separate and politically powerful narrative around the war by giving it a different name and a very different start date. The conflict there is known as the Great Patriotic War. And just look at those dates. It doesn't begin in 1939. It begins on June 22nd, 1941. And why that specific date? Because that's the day Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This framing turns the entire conflict into a defensive war for the fatherland. And this name was no accident. It was a very deliberate choice, meant to stir up memories of Russia's heroic resistance to Napoleon's invasion way back in 1812. The term actually appeared in the state newspaper Pravda just one day after the German invasion. It was specifically designed to rally the population and boost morale. And here's the really crucial point. Look at what this narrative conveniently leaves out. It completely erases the 2 years from 1939 to 1941, the 2 years when the Soviet Union was effectively an ally of Nazi Germany. It removes the Soviet invasion of Poland, the brutal Winter War against Finland, and the occupation of the Baltic states, all from the popular memory of the war. So this isn't just some academic debate for historians to argue about. These names and these dates are powerful political tools. They shape national identity, and they're still being used in international politics today. By framing the war as beginning in 1941, Russia presents itself solely as a victim of fascism and also its vanquisher. This memory is an absolute cornerstone of modern Russian national identity. But in a powerful countermove, Ukraine officially dropped that Soviet-era term back in 2015. They explicitly reframed their own history to start with the 1939 invasion of Poland, acknowledging that Ukraine was a victim of both Nazi and Soviet aggression.
So ultimately, what this all shows is that our choice of a start date isn't just about getting a fact right. It's the first chapter of a story. And how you write that first chapter, that determines who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and whose experience gets to be remembered at all.
We've all heard the saying that history is written by the victors. And sure, there's truth to that. But what we've seen today shows us something maybe even deeper. It's not just about who wins the war, but who has the power to set the timeline, to decide on page 1 where the story truly starts. And that's a question really worth thinking about.